trip is roughly 6 days, and its journey is fairly similar to that of our cargo Dragon when it makes its trips back and forth to the ISS.
All right, the crowd's getting into it. As we await that T-0 in just about 22 minutes, the ground operations teams are going to be doing a series of system checks just to make sure both Dragon and Falcon 9 are ready for liftoff. The moment we hit T-0 and a successful launch occurs, we'll watch Falcon 9 and Dragon make their ascent until Falcon 9 first and second stages separate and send Dragon on its way to the space station.
At this time, mission operators will prepare Dragon for on-orbit ops, and Dragon will execute a series of burns that gradually raise its orbit to align more closely with the space station, as you can see in this animation right here on the screen. As Dragon approaches ISS, it'll hold a few times before making one final push towards the space station, putting Dragon into the same orbital plane as it prepares for its approach and docking maneuvers.
And then next, Dragon will make its approach and actually dock with the space station. This is going to be a very different process from what we've seen with Dragon cargo deliveries in the past, which use a process called berthing, which requires somebody to be on the station to reach out and grab Dragon with the robotic arm. With docking not necessary, it's going to fly in all on its own.
Dragon will spend 5 days docked to ISS before preparing to return home. Following successful completion of Dragon's test objectives and cargo loading operations, the ISS crew on board will close out the cabin, perform final system checks, and configure the vehicle for undocking. Once the automated undocking sequence is complete, Dragon will execute 2 departure burns using its onboard Draco engines, pushing it away from the space station.
And then next on its trip home is deorbit, entry, and splashdown, and that's going to cover all operations following the final departure maneuver, including the trunk separation, closure of the nose cone, a deorbit burn, deployment of the drogue and main parachutes, and then finally splashdown, at which point teams from SpaceX will move in and recover Dragon from the water.
So that covers what to expect on this mission without crew, but it is important to remember that this entire operation is also a training opportunity when we do have astronauts on board. So let's go now to NASA's Jennifer Wolfinger at Kennedy Space Center with more on what's going on behind the scenes to prepare for Demo-2.
Thanks, Lauren. Ripley may be the only passenger on board this time, but our NASA and SpaceX teams are treating this launch as if Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley are flying in Crew Dragon, because next time they will be.
On launch day with the commercial partners, as soon as the crew walks into this room, the suit room, I officially hand them over to the partner. So SpaceX or Boeing officially takes charge of the crew at that point.
As NASA's Vehicle Integration Test Office Chief, veteran shuttle astronaut Shane Kimbrough plays a big part in insulating the crew before launch. As teams have been preparing for the Uncrewed Demo-1 flight, the crew has been suiting up, rehearsing with support teams what they will do for Demo-2. One major task has been dusting off the quarantine playbook. We didn't have to quarantine the crew this time, but for Demo-2, there's a lot of work that will go into making sure the crew is protected from any threat to their physical health in the days leading up to launch. It takes meticulous planning to make sure everyone who comes in contact with the astronauts is medically cleared to do so.
Launch day operations, while the crew's in quarantine, I control the crew pretty much. So from L-14 to launch day, they're mine, so to speak. Just make sure we run the schedules, we keep them in a quarantine situation, other people aren't coming up to them. On launch day in particular, I'm just making sure they're up, making sure they're moving along according to their timeline so they don't get behind.
And making sure they have a chance to connect with their families before they head to the launch pad.
One last look at your family and one last time to talk to them and tell them you love them, and you'll be back soon, those kind of things.
Right now, the Demo-2 crew is closely monitoring the pre-launch milestones inside of SpaceX's Launch Control Center, including propellant loading that began just a short time ago. The crew is using this morning to train for what will happen on Demo-2. Everything from strapping into their seats to being prepared to abort in the unlikely event of an emergency. These kinds of rehearsals are not new to the test teams, but this morning's Uncrewed launch is more than just a simulation. It's their first chance to practice the real thing. We've touched on all the preparation leading to this moment. Now let's talk about where the crew is heading, the International Space Station. Joining me to discuss this is David Brady. He's a scientist with the International Space Station program. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome, Jennifer.
Our viewers have been submitting questions on social media using the hashtag AskNASA. Let's check them out. Okay. At FlipFlopLife83 says, I can't imagine life without the science you guys accomplished up there. Do you think that this will help prolong space station missions?
Oh, absolutely, and it's so exciting to see the folks involved in this or out there that are so interested in the science, because after all, we're all here to celebrate the how, but we need to talk a little bit about the why. And the why is that Space Station exists as a world-class facility to do research in space. So we're hoping that our CCP capability is going to double the amount of research that we can do in terms of time. Now you might ask, how can you double the amount of research by adding one crew member? Well, as you know, the crew spends a lot of time maintaining the vehicle. They also have to be available for spacewalks, and for every visiting vehicle that comes and goes, they're an integral part of that. Once all that is covered, adding an additional crew member should provide the capacity to do nothing additional other than research. So we're very excited at the capacity to do that, because we're looking forward to even more discoveries, enabling more exploration, discovering things that will help commercial companies, and also benefiting people on Earth.
It's so exciting.
Oh yeah, it's really cool.
Let's see what our next question is. At JCS Amadora asks, will any cargo be returning from ISS with Crew Dragon back to Earth?
And we're expecting to be able to fly up about 200 pounds of cargo and also fly back 100 pounds of cargo, which may not seem like a whole lot, but one of the things that it'll be useful for in the research area is that, for example, we do a lot of life science research. And that life science research is dependent on biological samples. So as you might imagine, if you're a researcher that does biological research, you're looking forward to getting your samples back as often as possible, so you have flexibility in doing your research. So the new CCP capability, that's another thing that it will provide for us.
That's great. That's all the time we have, unfortunately. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with our viewers.
You're welcome.
Let's check back in with Stephanie and Shiva for an update.
Thanks, guys. We really love hearing the questions from the fans of today's launch. It's really awesome to hear those. Now, we would be remiss if we didn't tell you about the storied launch pad that Falcon 9 will lift off from today, which is Launch Complex 39A. It's also called Pad A here in Florida, and it's the site of many historic launches.
It's where NASA astronauts launched to the moon, and as Daryl Nail is going to tell us, it's where SpaceX has completed a 21st century makeover to the launch pad, launching us into the next generation of human spaceflight.
In the 1960s, NASA needed a new, bigger, and better launch pad, one capable of sending astronauts on historic journeys to the moon and back. To get there, that new pad needed to be capable of launching the most powerful rocket of its time, the mighty Saturn V. And so, in 1962, NASA began building the answer, Launch Complex 39A. At the bottom, a flame trench 1.5 football fields long. And above it, a launch tower connecting to a new concept at the time, mobilized launch platforms. With highly explosive rocket fuel nearby, an emergency escape system was added. NASA engineers designed a high-speed elevator and a 200-foot-long escape tube down to a blast-resistant bunker 40 feet underground. In November of 1967, NASA launched the first successful test flight of an unmanned Saturn V rocket from Pad 39A. Historic missions to the moon followed, and another pad, 39B, was added. Decades later, 39A and B were modified to support the Space Shuttle program.
And liftoff, the final liftoff of Atlantis.
From the 1980s all the way to the last launch in July of 2011. After that, the pads went dark. 3 years later, Pad 39A got a new lease on life. You see, NASA no longer needed 2 launch pads, so they upgraded it, and in 2014, SpaceX signed a 20-year lease agreement to launch their own rockets from here, as well as astronauts. And they'll be lifting off from the exact same place that Shuttle and Apollo astronauts once did. First, SpaceX needed to upgrade the pad. The massive rotating service structure used to load cargo into the Space Shuttle was removed. And the most recent addition? A new crew access arm, a modernized steel and aluminum structure so NASA astronauts can bridge the distance between the launch tower and the Dragon crew capsule.
Just under 6 years after the last space shuttle launch, fire and smoke returned to 39A when SpaceX launched NASA's 10th cargo resupply mission to the International Space Station. And a year later, SpaceX showed off the pad's versatility, launching a triple-boostered Falcon Heavy rocket on a test flight.
And that helped propel the number of launches here over the century mark, and more are planned. NASA and SpaceX have a contract to send astronauts to the International Space Station a half dozen times, and they're going to do it from right here at Pad 39A.
And the entire SpaceX team is truly honored that we're going to be launching astronauts again from Pad 39A.
At a little over 11 minutes, let's go back to this team at Space.